They used to sit side by side. Now there's distance, silence, and 1,000 unspoken words. What tore them apart, and why can't they look at each other? Why is there an empty seat between them? The question swept through the stadium like a gust of cold wind. Not spoken aloud, but mouthed, whispered, and typed furiously into fan chats, tweets, and live stream comment sections. The camera panned across the 7 members sitting on the stage for the long-awaited group interview. But it paused almost too long on the hollow space between Jungkook and Jimin. That was not where it was supposed to be. The light hit them unevenly. Jungkook bathed in gold, face stoic yet blinking too often. Jimin caught in soft white, gaze locked on the floor like it would give him answers. They didn't look at each other, not once. Not during the introduction, not during the opening jokes. Not even when Taehyung playfully nudged Jimin's shoulder, trying to bring back the usual sparkle in his expression. It didn't come, and that silence between them was deafening. Just 3 nights before, they had laughed together in a behind-the-scenes video. Jungkook had looped his arm around Jimin's shoulder, playfully stealing his drink. Jimin had grumbled and blushed, shoving him away only to pull him back in seconds later. The footage had gone viral for its warmth, their chemistry, their bond. But now Jimin's fingers fidgeted restlessly on the mic, and Jungkook's jaw tightened every time someone asked a question that even brushed close to the topic of recent changes in group dynamics. The interviewer, a veteran in the industry, noticed it too. Her voice faltered for a fraction of a second before moving on. Something had shattered, and it wasn't subtle. The fans felt it deep in their chests. The energy was wrong, like a song sung off-key or a painting smudged right down the center. And it had started even before the show. Backstage, makeup artists had noticed the tension. Jimin had arrived alone early, quiet. He had smiled, politely, to everyone, except to the one person who once made him smile, just by breathing near him. Jungkook had come later, hoodie up, head down, barely responding to greetings. They shared a green room, but not a glance. "Do you want to move your seat?" The manager had whispered to Jimin. He had paused, lips parting, then shook his head. Let him be. But on stage, when they sat down, that answer changed. The unclaimed chair between them was like a scar, raw, unhealed. And fans weren't stupid. The fan cams would later zoom in on every twitch of Jungkook's hand, every glance Jimin didn't steal. They would dissect every frame, comparing it to the way things used to be. Screen grabs from last year's concert, moments from hotel lobbies, car rides, airport gates, memories. They would realize that the last time the two were truly seen interacting was over 3 weeks ago, right before the rumored schedule shift. Right before Jungkook left early from the post-concert dinner. Right before Jimin posted that cryptic story, a photo of a ripped paper heart captioned with a single word, enough. At the center of it all were 2 boys who once moved in harmony, like twin shadows. Now they felt like strangers. Jungkook glanced sideways for half a second. That's all it took for fans to collectively hold their breath. But Jimin didn't look back. He sat still, eyes locked on the ground, the corner of his mouth twitching in restraint every time his name was mentioned. His laugh, when it came, felt forced, like a sound rehearsed. The group dynamic tried to mask the wound. Taehyung overcompensated with jokes. Namjoon tried to steer the conversation forward. Hoseok kept reaching out first to Jungkook, then to Jimin like a bridge, hoping to be built again. Yoongi's eyes observed everything in silence, like he was writing a song about the collapse happening before his eyes. And Jin, watching from the screen backstage, recovering from a minor injury, texted their manager a single message. What happened to them? No one replied. Back in the van after the show, the silence grew even thicker. Jimin took the far back seat. Jungkook slid into the middle, earbuds in, pretending music could drown out the storm inside. Taehyung looked between them, then sighed, choosing to sit in the front beside the driver. He didn't want to be in the middle of it again. The van moved forward, but no one did. Are we seriously going to keep doing this? Namjoon's voice finally cut through the quiet later that night in the hotel conference room. Everyone was there. Everyone but the 2 at the center of the storm. Yoongi, hands folded, said nothing. Hoseok leaned forward, brows drawn. We can't fix it if they won't talk. They were fine just last month. Jin added from the speakerphone, his voice filled with disbelief. Something happened, something real, and it had, but no one knew the full story except Jimin and Jungkook. 3 weeks ago, a single conversation had detonated everything. It had been late, past midnight. The studio was empty, except for them. Jungkook was reviewing his solo demo. Jimin had dropped by with coffee. A small gesture. Familiar. Safe. Until it wasn't. You said you'd tell me when you're ready, Jimin had murmured, voice low. It's been months. Jungkook didn't look up. Some things aren't meant to be said. Jimin had stepped forward, chest rising. Then why hold on at all? The music had continued playing behind them, but the silence between them screamed louder. I'm tired, Jimin whispered. Tired of guessing where I stand with you. And Jungkook, who had looked so strong on stage, who had stood firm through storms of pressure, fame, chaos, had said something that broke everything. Maybe you were never supposed to stand anywhere near me. That was the night Jimin stopped calling. The night Jungkook started deleting drafts of messages he never sent. Back in the present, the world kept spinning. Interviews were scheduled. Rehearsals were clocked. Performances were flawless. But the space between them on stage, off stage, even in the hearts of millions kept growing. And now, they sat apart. Not because of the seating arrangement, but because they didn't know how to sit together anymore. Fans kept asking questions. But the ones who once knew each other best, Jungkook and Jimin, were still trying to find the answers themselves. The rain started quietly that night. It whispered against the windows of the hotel suite like a memory that refused to be forgotten. The city outside was a blur of headlights and reflections. But inside, everything was still. Too still. The silence wasn't comforting. It throbbed between walls, between rooms, between two people who used to sit close enough for their shoulders to touch. Jimin stood near the window, one hand resting on the cool glass. He wasn't looking at the view. His reflection stared back at him, pale and unreadable, with tired eyes that had stopped sparkling weeks ago. Behind him, the room was dim. Only the bedside lamp cast a soft amber light across the floor, revealing the faint outline of his half-unpacked suitcase, a crumpled hoodie, and his phone face down on the table, screen black, silent. There was no knock when Jungkook entered. The door clicked quietly, and for a long moment, he just stood there, watching Jimin's back. He had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this moment. He had imagined walking in, pulling Jimin into a hug, whispering an apology that would undo the weeks of pain. He had imagined Jimin turning around with tears in his eyes and forgiving him instantly, the way he used to. He had even imagined an angry confrontation, something dramatic and loud, because at least that would mean they were still fighting times for each other. But Jimin didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't speak. I didn't know if you'd be here, Jungkook finally said, voice low, unsure. I wasn't going to be, Jimin replied, barely audible. But they needed us to rehearse together tomorrow. Jungkook stepped in slowly, the sound of his boots against the carpet strangely loud. You could have asked for a separate room. Jimin let out a humorless breath, half laugh, half sigh. I thought about it, but then I remembered we've been sleeping under the same roof for 7 years. What difference does a wall make now? The words weren't cruel. They were worse. They were hollow, like something drained of warmth. Jungkook's throat tightened. He wanted to ask if Jimin hated him now, if that one night at the studio had destroyed everything, but instead, he asked the question that had haunted him since the space between them began growing. Why didn't you fight me that night? Jimin blinked at his reflection, finally turning around to face him. His face looked thinner, cheekbones more pronounced, as if the emotional weight had left its mark physically. His eyes, though, were sharp. Honest. Exhausted. I did fight you, Jungkook. I just stopped when I realized I was the only one still bleeding. The words hit like a blade. Jungkook took a step back, as if physically struck. You said I was never supposed to stand near you, Jimin continued, voice steady. You told me not to wait for answers, so I stopped. I didn't mean it. You said it anyway, Jimin cut in. And maybe it wasn't the first time you thought it. Maybe it's just the first time you let it slip. Jungkook wanted to speak, but his mouth stayed open, trembling without sound. He had said it out of fear, out of confusion, out of some twisted self-defense. Because Jimin had always seen times too much asterisk, had always gotten too close, and Jungkook had started pulling away the moment he realized that what he felt for Jimin wasn't something that could be explained in press interviews or masked with fan service. He loved him, and that terrified him more than anything else. Jimin walked past him, slow and deliberate, picking up a water bottle from the nightstand. He took a sip, then sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees. "When did it become this hard?" he asked quietly. "We used to finish each other's sentences. Now we can't even sit beside each other without 1,000 people noticing something's wrong." "Because everything times is times wrong," Jungkook whispered. "Because I said something I didn't know how to take back. Because I kept hurting you even when all I wanted was to protect you." Jimin looked up at him. "Protect me from what? From times you asterisk?" Jungkook didn't answer. He walked toward the other bed, the one he was supposed to sleep in, and sat down, mirroring Jimin's position facing forward, bent over, hands clasped. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it might as well have been an ocean. "I wasn't ready," he finally admitted. "For everything. For what I was feeling. For what it meant. I kept thinking if I ignored it, it would go away. It didn't," Jimin said. "No," Jungkook whispered. It just grew louder. There was a beat of silence. Then two. Then a third. "You think I wasn't scared too?" Jimin asked, voice rising just slightly. "Do you know how many nights I stared at my phone, writing things I'd never send? How many times I almost asked you to just times say it, times anything, even if it was goodbye? I didn't know how," Jungkook said. "Every time I looked at you, it felt too big. Like if I said one word, the whole world would hear it. And I didn't know if I was ready for that." Jimin's eyes glistened, but he didn't blink them away. "So you chose silence?" "I chose times wrong, asterisk," Jungkook said, voice cracking. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders trembled, and Jimin watched him not with anger, but with the kind of pain that comes from loving someone too deeply and for too long. "I never wanted us to fall apart," Jungkook whispered. "But I didn't know how to keep us together without losing myself." Jimin stood slowly, walking toward him, every step cautious, like approaching a wounded animal. When he reached him, he knelt down so they were eye level. "I wasn't asking you to give up yourself," he said softly. "I just wanted to be part of the life you were already living." Jungkook looked up. Their eyes met for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I don't know if we can go back," Jungkook said. "We don't have to," Jimin replied. "But maybe we can start times again. Not as idols, not as a performance, just as two people who care." The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the city into streaks of gold and gray. Jungkook reached out, hesitated, then touched Jimin's hand just barely. But Jimin didn't pull away. And for the first time in weeks, the space between them didn't feel impossible to cross. The next day when they walked into rehearsal, the chair between them was still there. But Jungkook looked at it, then looked at Jimin, and he moved it aside. He sat next to him not out of obligation, not because the script said to, but because he times wanted to asterisk. Because something had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but shifted. And the fans noticed. This time, the livestream comments said something different. "They're still distant," one fan wrote. But Jungkook looked at Jimin today. Really times looked asterisk. "They didn't smile yet," another noted. "But they sat together again. That means something." It did, because love wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was in the small decisions, the seat you chose, the words you dared to say, the silence you finally broke. They sat closer now, and that was a beginning. The practice room echoed with the rhythmic thuds of footsteps and the crisp instructions of the choreographer. But beneath the surface of sweat and beats, there was a silent current, something that hummed low and constant between them. The first hour of rehearsal went by in a blur of motions. The group synchronized in routine, but disjointed in spirit. Every time Jungkook moved, his peripheral vision tracked Jimin not to monitor him, but to remind himself that he was still here, still standing beside him, still choosing to stay in the room. Jimin, on the other hand, danced like he was searching for something in every count, every move sharper than necessary, as if trying to cut through the invisible tension still woven into the air. Their bodies remembered the rhythm, but their eyes, those told the real story. Not once did they lock eyes during the choreo, even during parts of the formation that used to ignite spontaneous smiles or cheeky gestures between them. There was no subtle shoulder bump this time, no half smirk exchanged in the mirror, but there was presence. That, in itself, was progress. During a short water break, Jimin sat on the floor with his back against the wall, sweat dripping from his temple, chest rising and falling. Jungkook stood on the opposite side of the room, gripping his water bottle, watching Jimin out of the corner of his eye. He wanted to walk over. He wanted to say something mundane about the set list, the lighting, the choreo. Anything that didn't feel like walking a tightrope over an emotional abyss. But he stayed frozen, paralyzed by the weight of too many unspoken things. Namjoon was the one who broke the silence first. "You two need to talk," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He wasn't asking. He was commanding, not as the leader of BTS, but as someone who had carried them through countless storms, someone who knew that silence could be more dangerous than any scandal. Jimin looked up at him, then glanced briefly at Jungkook before averting his eyes again. "We already did." "Then do it again," Namjoon said, "until it doesn't hurt anymore." Jungkook set his bottle down and walked over without a word. He didn't sit beside Jimin. He crouched down in front of him, resting his arms on his knees, eyes searching Jimin's face. The others knew to give them space. One by one, they trickled out of the room, pretending to check their phones, stretching outside, or reviewing lyrics with staff. When they were alone, Jungkook finally spoke. "I keep thinking about the time we recorded in Busan," he said. "Remember? That night when the lights went out and we sat in the dark with just that old speaker playing our demo on loop?" Jimin didn't respond immediately. His gaze stayed low, fixed on the floor between them. "You said you liked the version with your harmony better," Jungkook continued. "And I said I didn't, but I was lying. I just wanted to act cool." "I know," Jimin murmured. Jungkook blinked. "You do?" Jimin's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I always knew when you were lying. You had this tiny twitch in your jaw." Jungkook exhaled, a sound of quiet defeat, and something almost like laughter. "I guess I'm not very good at hiding things from you." "No," Jimin said softly. "You're not." Jungkook lowered himself to sit fully on the floor. Their knees were almost touching now. "Then why did we let it get this bad?" Jimin's hand flexed slightly, his fingers curling into the fabric of his sweatpants. "Because we were both scared," he whispered. "And when people get scared, they pull away before they get hurt. But we got hurt anyway." "Yeah," Jimin said. "We did." A long pause settled between them, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the dust of things beginning to settle after a storm. Outside the glass window, the clouds were parting too, the dull gray giving way to the faintest tint of blue. The light shifted across the floor, as if the room itself was breathing easier. Jungkook leaned his head back against the wall beside Jimin, letting their arms rest side by side, barely brushing. "I don't want to lose you," he said, almost inaudible. "You didn't," Jimin replied. "You just misplaced me for a while." That night, back at the hotel, they shared a meal in the quiet comfort of their room. Nothing dramatic. Just simple dishes ordered through room service, eaten with soft clinks of chopsticks and the occasional comment about how the rice was too sticky or the soup too salty. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was honest. Jimin sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through his phone, when he suddenly chuckled. "Do you remember that fan edit where they said we had telepathy because we always wore the same outfits without planning?" Jungkook, seated at the edge of the bed, tying his hair into a messy bun, laughed. "That wasn't telepathy. That was you stealing my hoodies." "They looked better on me." "I didn't say they didn't." Jimin looked up at him, expression soft. "Why did we ever stop doing this?" Jungkook turned to face him fully. "Because I stopped trusting myself with you." Jimin nodded slowly. "Then let's start again. Not pretending it didn't happen. Just from where we are." From that night on, things began to shift again, not overnight, but in small, fragile steps. During their next live stream, fans caught the moment Jungkook passed Jimin a water bottle off camera, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. During a radio interview, Jimin made a subtle joke about Jungkook's obsession with hair ties, and Jungkook didn't roll his eyes. He laughed, genuinely, the sound catching in his throat like it surprised him. And when they performed on stage again, there was a moment, barely 2 seconds, where Jimin looked at Jungkook during the bridge of their ballad, and Jungkook, sensing it, turned his head ever so slightly. They didn't smile, but they didn't look away. Their dynamic remained different, more cautious, less reckless, like a bond reforged through fire, scarred but stronger. Some days, they still drifted. Some days, they talked deep into the night, like nothing had ever broken between them. There were setbacks, moments of hesitation, but there was also grace, an unspoken promise to keep showing up, even when it was hard. The fans who truly saw them, the ones who had been there since the start, noticed the difference. They stopped asking why they sat apart, because now, even when they weren't physically close, there was a new kind of connection, the kind that comes from choosing each other again, not out of convenience, not out of nostalgia, but out of understanding, of growth. And one evening, weeks later, during a quiet moment backstage before a major awards performance, Jimin stood beside Jungkook as they waited for their cue. Their hands brushed slightly. Not an accident. "You still twitch your jaw when you lie," Jimin whispered. Jungkook turned his head, grinning slightly. "Then I guess I better stop lying." Jimin leaned closer, just enough for their shoulders to touch. "Please do." Under the stage lights, everything felt weightless. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a sea of light sticks and screaming voices. But to Jimin and Jungkook, there was only the sound of breath. Inhale, exhale. Every step they took together across the stage was a quiet rebellion against the silence that once stretched between them like a canyon. Tonight, their bodies moved in tandem, their vocals blending with a familiar warmth that neither had felt in weeks. As the spotlight passed over them, their shadows intertwined briefly, like a secret handshake from the universe itself, a reminder that not all broken things stay broken. After the final bow, as confetti rained and the encore song faded, they returned to the backstage area where laughter buzzed, stylists fluttered with towels and water bottles, and the adrenaline still pulsed hot under their skin. Jungkook peeled off his in-ear monitors, heart hammering not from the performance, but from the glance Jimin had sent him during the final chorus. It wasn't staged. It wasn't for the fans. It had been real, lingering, quietly charged. Jimin stood by the mirror, dabbing sweat from his temple, his eyes catching Jungkook's through the reflection. He didn't look away. Neither did Jungkook. The chaos around them blurred into silence. Later that night, after the van ride full of post-show chatter and the hotel lobby filled with camera flashes and distant shouting, they found themselves alone again. This time not by accident, but by choice. Jungkook knocked softly on Jimin's door, already slightly ajar. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped in to find Jimin sitting on the floor by the window, legs stretched out, a hoodie draped over his frame, sleeves pulled past his wrists. The curtains were half drawn, city lights bleeding through in golden ribbons. A low hum of traffic filled the space between them. "You came," Jimin said without looking up. "I didn't want to let tonight end without this," Jungkook replied, his voice low. Jimin glanced sideways, patting the space beside him. "Sit." Jungkook sank to the floor beside him, their shoulders not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. For a long moment, they said nothing, just breathed together, listening to the muted heartbeat of the city. "Tonight felt different," Jimin said. "It was. You weren't pretending." "I never was," Jungkook said. "I was just scared of being real." Jimin nodded slowly, processing. "I used to watch you on stage and wonder if you still saw me the same way. There was a time I could read everything in your eyes. Then suddenly, they were closed off." Jungkook turned his head. "They weren't closed to you. Just guarded. I was trying to protect something I didn't understand yet." "What changed?" "You," Jungkook whispered. "You stopped waiting." Jimin swallowed. "It hurt to wait. It still does." "I know," Jungkook said. And I'm sorry. For the distance. For every time I made you doubt where you stood. He reached over slowly, fingers brushing Jimin's sleeve. Jimin didn't pull away. I missed this, Jungkook continued. Not just us being okay. I missed you. The way you roll your eyes when I sing too loud in the morning. The way you hum under your breath when you're nervous. I missed your steadiness. Your chaos. Your care. Jimin let out a soft breath. Then why did you push me away? Because you were the one person I couldn't afford to lose, Jungkook said. And I thought if I got too close, I'd break it. I didn't realize I was breaking it by not holding on. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full of memories, of echoes, of things they had once said under different skies. The weight of it all settled around them like a heavy blanket, comforting, suffocating, real. Jimin leaned his head back against the wall. I still have that necklace you gave me in Tokyo. Jungkook's lips twitched. The one you swore you'd lost? I lied. I didn't want to explain why I still wore it. You don't have to. They both laughed softly, the sound tentative but genuine. Hours passed in that room, the conversation weaving in and out of vulnerability and nostalgia. They spoke of small things, their favorite performances, awkward airport moments, shared meals in silence. Then heavier things, missed calls, misunderstood texts, nights spent wondering what went wrong. And then, as the sky began to lighten with the earliest shade of morning, Jimin whispered something that stayed in the air like a heartbeat. And when they walked onto that stage, there was no empty chair between them. There never would be again.
Do you think we can be okay again? Jungkook looked at him, eyes soft. I don't want to be what we were. I want to be better. He held out his pinky. Jimin stared at it. Not a promise, Jungkook clarified, just a start. Slowly, Jimin reached out and hooked his finger around Jungkook. It was enough. The next few weeks unfolded with careful intention. At rehearsals, they spoke more freely, laughed in shared corners, and rediscovered the ease that once defined them. The staff noticed. The members noticed. And the fans, sharp-eyed and intuitive, began to breathe easier. Fan edits turned from analyzing silences to capturing moments of quiet joy. A backstage clip showed Jimin fixing Jungkook's collar without thinking. A fancam caught Jungkook gently guiding Jimin away from a chaotic crowd at an event. These were not grand gestures, but they were honest. One night, during a live Q&A, someone asked a question that made everyone in the room freeze for a second. Are you two okay now? The host said, not unkindly, eyes darting between them. The room held its breath. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked at Jimin. And they both smiled, not wide, not performative, but with the kind of smile that spoke of storms survived and still skis ahead. We're working on it, Jungkook said. Jimin added, and we're not going anywhere. It wasn't a headline quote, it wasn't clickbait. But for those who truly understood them, it was everything. They had sat apart once. Now they stood side by side, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And sometimes that's where healing begins. The rain returned that evening, as if the skis themselves remembered how everything began soft, uncertain, and laced with silence. The streets below glistened under the weight of it, headlights carving through puddles like stars dragging across glass. Inside the studio, far away from the flashing cameras and public gazes, Jungkook and Jimin sat on opposite ends of the same leather couch, the space between them no longer hostile, but still echoing with what once was. The soft hum of an unfinished track played in the background. Taehyung's voice on the demo, layered and vulnerable, drifted through the speakers. Jungkook tapped his fingers against his knee, rhythm lost somewhere between thought and hesitation. Jimin stared at the glass wall behind which producers quietly adjusted levels, deliberately avoiding eye contact to give them the illusion of privacy. But everyone knew this moment mattered. This was where the real music happened, in stillness, in choice. Jimin broke the silence first. We could use that take from last week, the one where your voice cracks a little in the second verse. It feels real. Jungkook looked at him, really looked at him. You remember that? Jimin's gaze didn't waver. I remember all of them. Jungkook's throat tightened, even the ones where I disappeared halfway through. Especially those, Jimin said softly, because those were the ones I stayed for, hoping you'd come back. Jungkook leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The air between them was thick with memory, but also something new, willingness. I hated the distance, he said, even when I was the one creating it. Jimin turned toward him slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching, not into a smile, but into something that suggested understanding, maybe even forgiveness. Then stop making it. The words weren't a plea, they were a bridge, fragile yes, but real. Jungkook reached for his phone, scrolling quickly through his voice memos before pressing play on a recording labeled simply, 2MJ Ver. A raw, acoustic version of the song filled the room, just his voice. No edits, no instruments, every breath audible, every crack in his tone a confession. Jimin listened without speaking, eyes closed. When the final note faded, he opened them again, blinking slowly. You wrote that about us. I didn't know it at the time, Jungkook admitted. But yeah, I guess I did. Jimin's fingers curled around the edge of the cushion. Then let's finish it together. That night they stayed long after the producers had gone, after the lights had dimmed and the hallway outside grew quiet. They reworked lyrics, rearranged harmonies. But more than that, they relearned how to talk, how to lean in, how to laugh again even if cautiously. Jimin told Jungkook about the dreams he had, of stages they hadn't yet stepped on, of songs they hadn't yet sung, of cities where they could walk freely, not as idols but as themselves. Jungkook told Jimin about the fear that clawed at his chest before every interaction, that maybe one wrong word would destroy everything, that maybe he wasn't enough to hold onto something so rare. You don't have to hold it alone, Jimin had said. They left the studio as the sun rose, bleary-eyed and bone-tired, but lighter. As they stepped into the cold morning, their arms brushed. Jungkook didn't pull away. Neither did Jimin. A few days later, the group had a shoot for a campaign that required them to sit in pairs. The stylists, nervous, looked around, unsure how to assign seats. I'll sit with him, Jungkook said casually, pointing toward Jimin. And Jimin, without flinching, replied, You sure you can handle me again? Jungkook smirked, I think I'm finally ready. The staff chuckled, the tension broke, the cameras began rolling. They didn't touch during the shoot, not in the obvious way, but their energy was different. It was subtle, how Jimin leaned slightly into Jungkook during the third frame, how Jungkook's eyes followed Jimin's when he wasn't speaking, how their laughter overlapped at just the right moments. The final photo would go viral days later, captioned by fans as, They're not just okay, they're something better. Still, healing isn't linear. There were moments when the silence crept back in, when exhaustion played tricks on their minds, and history weighed heavy again. But each time they chose to sit down, to talk, to listen. One evening, after a long rehearsal, Jimin found Jungkook on the rooftop of their building, hoodie up, hair damp from the drizzle. I was looking for you, Jimin said. Jungkook didn't turn around. I knew you'd come. Jimin stepped beside him, the city stretching out before them. Why are you up here? I wanted to see if the sky still looked the same without us talking. Jimin glanced upward. It doesn't. Jungkook chuckled. No, it doesn't. They stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing, because sometimes words aren't the answer. Sometimes presence is enough. Months passed. Tour dates were announced. A comeback was scheduled. Press started speculating again. Every interaction was analyzed, dissected, spun into headlines. But this time, they weren't faking it. They walked into interviews with quiet confidence, sat beside each other not because it was required, but because it felt right. When asked about their past tension, they didn't deny it. We had to relearn how to be, Jimin said in one. Jungkook added, and it's the best thing we've done for each other. Fans cried watching that clip, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The night before their first world tour stop, Jimin knocked on Jungkook's door. No words were exchanged, just a look, a nod. They sat together on the hotel balcony, overlooking a city that didn't know the weight of what they'd survived. Jungkook turned to Jimin. What if we mess up again? Jimin met his eyes. Then we fix it again. And Jungkook believed him. Because love, real love, is not about perfection. It's about choosing. Over and over. Even when it's hard. Especially then. The next day when they took the stage, there was no space between them. They didn't need to say anything. The world already knew. The stadium lights burned like a second sun, drenching the stage in white fire. Screams rose like thunder, echoing against steel and glass as the first note of the opening track shattered the stillness. Every heartbeat synced with the pounding bass, and beneath the dazzle of strobe and smoke, Jungkook and Jimin stood side by side, poised to run headfirst into the moment they had feared would never come again. They didn't look at each other immediately, not because they were avoiding it, but because they were waiting, for the right moment, for something sacred. And when it came, during the last chorus, during the breath between two harmonies, they turned, eyes locking through the roar of the crowd, and in that fraction of time the universe folded in on itself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, but it was real, and it was theirs. The fans didn't miss it. They never did. The way Jungkook's hand hovered just a little too long behind Jimin's back when they walked off stage. The way Jimin leaned closer when he whispered something in Jungkook's ear during the encore. They had been apart. Now they weren't. And that space between them, the one that had once screamed of loss, was now filled with something quieter but far more powerful. Backstage, as sweat clung to their skin and stylists fluttered like moths fixing details, the two of them retreated to the far side of the dressing room, wordless in their understanding. Jimin sat on the arm of the couch while Jungkook toweled off his neck, both of them staring at the ground like it held a secret they hadn't unlocked yet. That crowd, Jungkook finally said, voice a rasp. Jimin smiled without looking up. They felt it too. Jungkook turned toward him. Us. Jimin glanced sideways. Always us. He stood slow and unhurried, then walked past him toward the small kitchenette in the corner. He opened the fridge, grabbed 2 bottles of water and held one out behind him. Without even needing to look, Jungkook took it, fingers brushing Jimin's, a pulse between touch and memory. Remember the first tour? Jimin asked, unscrewing his cap. When we didn't know how to sleep without music playing. I still can't, Jungkook murmured. That's why I kept your old playlist. I listen to it sometimes when I can't breathe. Jimin didn't reply right away. He sat back down, this time beside him. I didn't know you still had that. I didn't delete anything, Jungkook said. Not the songs, not the photos, not the texts I never sent. Jimin closed his eyes just for a second. Then maybe we were never really apart. Just lost, Jungkook whispered, but always looking. They didn't speak after that, not for a while. The silence was no longer sharp, it was soft, like a familiar blanket on an unfamiliar night. Outside, the stadium lights dimmed, and the hum of dispersing fans rumbled like a memory that refused to settle. In the weeks that followed, their bond unfolded not in grand gestures, but in moments that lived in the margins of their fame. A hand placed on a lower back guiding through crowds. A jacket passed over in the cold. A voicemail left during a layover. They were rebuilding slowly, brick by brick, not aiming for what once was, but for what could be. One night after their stop in Paris, they wandered out of the hotel in hoodies and masks, finding their way to the Seine without security, without a plan. Just the two of them beneath a sky heavy with stars and stories. Jimin leaned against the railing, the water shimmering beneath them. This city always feels like it's watching. Jungkook stood beside him, hands deep in his pockets. Maybe it is. Jimin turned, eyes catching in the moonlight. What do you think it sees? Jungkook hesitated. Two idiots who finally figured out how to stay. Jimin smiled, soft and unreadable. You think we've figured it out? No, Jungkook said, stepping a little closer. But I think we're trying, and I think that counts. He reached out slowly, fingers grazing the fabric of Jimin's sleeve. Not quite a touch, just enough to ask a question. And Jimin answered, not with words but by closing the distance, their shoulders meeting as they both turned back to the river, exhaling together in the cold. Later that week, during a behind-the-scenes shoot, a staff member asked them to sit side by side for a casual interview. No cue cards, just conversation. What's changed the most about your dynamic over the years? The director asked. Jungkook glanced at Jimin, who didn't look away this time. We stopped pretending, Jimin said. And started listening, Jungkook added. There was a pause, then the sound of pens scribbling, camera shutters clicking. But between them there was only peace. Tour life was never easy. It took them across time zones and into moments of fatigue so deep they forgot their own names. But through it all, they were different now. Not perfect, but chosen. One night in New York, after an emotional performance, Jungkook found himself staring at Jimin's back as he stood by the dressing room mirror, wiping off makeup in slow, tired motions. The room was nearly empty, just the two of them again. Jungkook stepped forward, picked up a cloth, and silently took over, dabbing at Jimin's cheek with the kind of care that didn't need explaining. Jimin closed his eyes. You always do that when I'm too tired to ask. I remember the little things, Jungkook said, even when I forget everything else. Jimin opened his eyes slowly. Then remember this too. He reached up, resting his hand gently over Jungkook's. We're okay now. Jungkook nodded. Yeah, we are. And the next day, when they stood on stage in front of thousands, something new radiated between them. Not just comfort, not just history, but trust. It wasn't the kind of story that ends with fireworks. It was the kind that begins again, every day. Because love like theirs, quiet, resilient, messy, doesn't end. It just learns how to stay. They didn't tell anyone when they booked a later flight out of Tokyo. Not the staff, not the other members, not even their managers until the morning after. It wasn't rebellion, it was self-preservation. After weeks of back-to-back rehearsals, press, fan events, and flashing lights, they needed something real, something quiet, something that wasn't watched, measured, recorded. The city was glowing behind rain-streaked glass as they sat in the corner booth of a dimly lit cafe tucked into a sleepy neighborhood miles away from the glimmering skyline BTS usually occupied. Here, no one screamed. No one pointed. No one knew them as icons. Just two souls trying to breathe again. Jungkook stirred the foam of his coffee with the tip of his spoon, his gaze not on the cup but on Jimin, who was leaning against the window with a paper cup pressed between both hands, eyes distant, like he was listening to music that only existed in memory. There was a melancholy in the way he blinked, slow and reflective, as if every part of him was still unlearning how to stop expecting disappointment. I forgot how quiet the world is, Jungkook murmured. Jimin didn't look at him immediately, just let the thought rest between them. It's not the world that got louder, he said finally. We just got used to silencing ourselves. That stayed with Jungkook. He reached for his phone, habitually scrolling to the notes app he hadn't opened in weeks. Dozens of half-written lyrics filled the screen, unsent messages, lines scratched out. One in particular made his thumb pause. You were always too close to notice I was breaking. He locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. I want to write again, he said softly. Jimin's lips curved faintly, then start. Yeah, Jungkook looked up, but with you. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was trust, laid bare and quiet on a rainy Tokyo night. Jimin reached across the table, his fingers brushing Jungkook's wrist. Not to hold, not to pull, just to feel, to make sure this wasn't some fragile dream stitched together by exhaustion. "We'll write," he said, "but not just music." The words meant something else, deeper. They returned to the hotel after midnight, coats damp, hair mussed by wind. Jungkook walked beside Jimin in the hallway, their footsteps muffled by plush carpet and sleep-heavy silence. They did part ways when they reached Jimin's door. Jungkook lingered, thumb grazing the hem of his sleeve. "You don't have to say it," Jimin whispered. Jungkook shook his head. "I will, when the words don't shake anymore." Jimin unlocked the door and stepped aside, waiting. Jungkook followed. No cameras, no lights, just two heartbeats and the quiet sound of healing. They didn't sleep right away. They talked about things they never had time to before, the people they used to be, the spaces between hotel rooms, the letters they never sent. They laughed at old rumors, cried at things they'd buried too deep to unearth before now. Jimin told Jungkook how lonely it felt when they shared the stage but not the silence. Jungkook confessed he used to wait for Jimin to knock on his door, and when he stopped, he realized how much he had taken for granted. "Every time you chose to stay quiet," Jungkook said, "I told myself it was fine, but it was. I missed you even when you were right in front of me." Jimin looked down at his hands. "I didn't know if I had the right to miss you anymore." "You always do," Jungkook replied. The night faded into early morning. At some point their words slowed, bodies leaned into one another like trees leaning in the wind, tired, resilient. Jimin's head rested on Jungkook's shoulder. Jungkook tilted his face slightly, pressing his cheek against Jimin's hair. The kind of closeness that didn't need explanation. They woke up to soft daylight filtering through heavy curtains, limbs tangled, breath warm between them. Jimin stirred first, blinking slowly before realizing Jungkook's arm was wrapped loosely around his waist. He didn't move. He closed his eyes again and let it stay. When they rejoined the others that afternoon, something in their energy had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but even Taehyung noticed. The way they stood just a little closer. The way Jimin nudged Jungkook's arm when he zoned out during briefing. The way Jungkook instinctively passed Jimin a water bottle without being asked. It was the small things. The fans noticed too. A photo from the airport went viral, not because they were holding hands or doing anything overt, but because Jungkook was laughing. The kind of laugh that crinkled his eyes, that made his shoulders shake. And Jimin was watching him, not with possession, not with caution, but with pride. They didn't sit apart anymore. Even when the formation called for it somehow, they found their way back to each other. During sound check, during breaks, during moments when the cameras were off and the lights dimmed. One night, backstage in Seoul, after their final show of the leg, they sat on the floor of the green room surrounded by half-empty water bottles, confetti still stuck to their clothes. "I used to think we were unbreakable," Jimin said. Jungkook looked at him. "We were. But we did break." Jungkook nodded, and we put the pieces back with our hands shaking. Jimin smiled tiredly. "It still scares me, what we have. It scares me more to lose it again." Silence, but it didn't sting this time. It settled like a shared secret. Jungkook reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook, pages worn, corners curled. "I've been writing again," he said, handing it to Jimin. Jimin opened it slowly, eyes scanning the messy handwriting. Lyrics, fragments. One page had his name at the top, followed by a line that made his throat tighten. "Even when I ran, I always left the light on for you." He looked up. "I want to record this with you," Jungkook said. Jimin didn't answer with words. He reached for Jungkook's hand, fingers intertwining. In that moment, it didn't matter how many months they had spent apart, how many unsent messages had sat in their phones. What mattered was now, this breath, this choice. They were no longer performing closeness. They were choosing it. Every day. Again and again. And the world, watching them from afar, didn't need explanations. Because some connections don't need to be shouted. They just need to be felt. The studio felt colder than usual that night. Not from the temperature, someone had set the thermostat just right, but from the kind of stillness that only came when the room had heard too many confessions, too many late-night recordings stained with heartache and healing. The same chair creaked as Jungkook shifted, hunched over the mixing console, the flickering LED lights casting soft shadows under his eyes. Jimin sat a few feet behind him on the floor, legs stretched out, back against the wall, a mug of now-cold tea resting between his hands. Neither had said much since they arrived. They didn't need to. Their silences had changed. Where once it had been a chasm filled with questions, tension, unspoken guilt, now it felt steady, lived in. The kind of silence between people who had already said what needed to be said and were just existing in the aftermath of truth. Jungkook's fingers paused over the space bar, hovering. Then he pressed play. The raw demo spilled into the room, their voices layered unevenly, the harmonies unpolished, but that's what made it feel alive. Jimin's voice was softer in this version, more hesitant, almost whispering the second verse, and Jungkook came in like a shadow, low, aching, filling the empty corners Jimin had left behind. They hadn't meant to make it so intimate, but it had turned out that way. Not because of production, but because of who they were when they sang it. Jimin closed his eyes. He could hear it in the recording, the weight of the words they hadn't dared to speak the day they laid those tracks down. The pain was still there, but so was something else, a kind of fragile acceptance that even broken things could become beautiful if they were held carefully enough. When the final note faded, Jungkook didn't speak. He just turned around slowly in the swivel chair, meeting Jimin's eyes in the dim light. "I didn't think I could write something that honest," he said. Jimin's fingers traced the rim of his mug. "You didn't, you lived it." That made Jungkook exhale, a shaky breath that sounded more like relief than anything else. He stood, stretched, then walked over, lowering himself to sit on the floor beside Jimin, mirroring his position. Their shoulders didn't quite touch, but the distance was deliberate this time, not born from fear but respect. "You ever think," Jungkook began quietly, "about how all of this, everything we are, almost slipped through our fingers?" Jimin nodded, more than I'd like to admit. Jungkook leaned back, head resting against the wall, looking up at the ceiling like it held answers. "If we hadn't talked that night in the hotel, if you didn't let me in again, I don't think I'd be sitting here. I don't think I'd still be singing," Jimin said softly. Jungkook turned his head sharply. "Don't say that." "It's true," Jimin looked over. "When we stopped talking, I started to forget what music felt like. I was still performing, still moving, but I wasn't feeling anything. You were my anchor, and I didn't realize how deep I'd been drifting until it was gone." Jungkook swallowed hard. "I should have said something sooner." "You weren't ready," Jimin replied, not accusing. "And maybe I wasn't either." They sat in that silence again, the one that had grown familiar. Outside the window, the night deepened, Tokyo's distant hum just a dull rhythm beyond the glass. The studio lights glowed low and warm, bathing them in gold, like the world had stopped rushing just for them to catch up. "You're not just my anchor," Jungkook said suddenly. "You're the map too, you're how I find my way back." Jimin looked down, lips parting, eyes suddenly shining. "Say that again." Jungkook smiled faintly. "You're the map." Jimin's voice trembled. "You're the reason I still believe people can choose each other, even after everything." "I'll keep choosing you," Jungkook said, "even when I'm lost, especially then." This time Jimin reached out first. His hand found Jungkook on the floor, fingers slipping between his. No dramatics, no declarations, just presence. The kind of touch that says, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." The next week they flew to New York for a performance on a major late-night show. The rest of the group was vibrant, energetic, feeding off the buzz of the city, but Jungkook and Jimin stayed quiet, grounded. Different. During rehearsals, their eyes kept finding each other, and not once did either of them flinch. There was a moment backstage, right before they went on. Jungkook adjusted his in-ear, glancing at Jimin as the makeup artist patted the last bit of powder under his jaw. "You nervous?" Jimin asked. "No," Jungkook smiled, "not with you here." And when they took the stage under the glaring lights and millions of eyes, something in their stance told a story words couldn't. They weren't just singing. They were reclaiming every note, every look, every movement that pulled them subtly closer during the bridge. It wasn't performance. It was memory, alive, breathing, stronger than shame. The fans felt it. The clip trended within an hour. Headlines didn't need to exaggerate. They were watching two people return to each other in real time, and this time they didn't look away. After the performance, they slipped out the back door of the studio and found themselves walking the quiet streets of Manhattan, far from the noise, hands in their pockets, hoodies up. It started snowing lightly, unexpected. The kind of snow that doesn't last long, but is just enough to make the world feel different for a moment. Jimin looked up, flakes catching in his hair. "I used to dream about this." "What, us being here?" "No," Jimin laughed softly, "us being okay." Jungkook's gaze lingered on him. "Me too." They walked a little farther. Then Jungkook stopped and turned to him, under the orange glow of a street lamp. "I don't want to just be okay with you." Jimin tilted his head, curious. "Then what do you want?" "I want us to be better. The kind of better that makes the silence worth surviving." Jimin stepped closer, then stop surviving it, start living it. Jungkook reached up and brushed the snow from Jimin's lashes. "With you." "With me," Jimin said. And somewhere between snowflakes and laughter, the spaces between them finally disappeared completely. Not with a kiss, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a promise. One carved in quiet moments, in missed chances made right, in every breath that said, "I'm here, and I won't leave again." They returned to the hotel sometime before dawn, exhaustion softening every movement. As they reached their floor, Jungkook paused. "Stay in my room tonight?" he asked. Jimin looked at him. "You sure?" Jungkook nodded. "I sleep better when you're close." That night the city slept while two people finally did too, shoulder to shoulder, heartbeat to heartbeat. And in the quiet that had once been so painful, there was now peace. The morning light spilled slowly into the room, casting gentle streaks across the white sheets tangled at their feet. Jungkook stirred first, his breath catching softly as he blinked against the brightness. It took him a second to remember where he was, not because it was unfamiliar, but because peace had been a stranger for so long. But there it was, Jimin curled loosely beside him, one arm flung over the pillow, his hair messy, cheek pressed against the fabric like he hadn't moved all night. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't temporary. They were here, and they were safe. Jungkook didn't move. He didn't want to break the stillness. For the first time in months, his mind wasn't racing with rehearsals or regrets. He just watched, counted each breath Jimin took, studied the way his fingers twitched slightly as he shifted in his sleep, lips parting as he sighed quietly. These were the things he used to miss, little moments he only ever saw from a distance, always too afraid to let himself belong to them. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Jimin's forehead, careful not to wake him. But Jimin's eyes fluttered open at the touch anyway. He blinked slowly, adjusting, his gaze locking onto Jungkook, with the kind of intimacy that needed no words. "You stayed," he murmured. Jungkook nodded, voice low. "I told you I would." Jimin's eyes softened. "It feels real now." "It is." They lay in that space for a while, no hurry, no expectations. Just the quiet understanding that whatever had once broken between them had been mended not through grand gestures, but through these small, steady mornings. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't viral. But it was real, and real was everything. Later, they shared a quiet breakfast, hidden in a private corner of the hotel's rooftop cafe. The city below buzzed to life, but up here, It was just them. Jimin ate slowly, occasionally nudging his toast toward Jungkook's plate when he thought he wasn't eating enough. Jungkook chuckled under his breath, stealing a piece anyway just to make him smile. "You remember that one time in London?" Jimin asked suddenly, looking out over the skyline. "Which time?" "The one where I dragged you out in the rain at 2 in the morning, because I was craving strawberries." Jungkook smirked. "How could I forget? You didn't even eat them." "I did just later when you weren't looking." Jungkook leaned back, arms folded. "You know I stood in line for 20 minutes in soaked sneakers." Jimin grinned. "And yet you'd do it again." Jungkook tilted his head. "Yeah, I would." It wasn't just nostalgia. These stories weren't just about their past, they were breadcrumbs. Proof that even in the chaos of being global icons, they had never really let go of each other. The world saw the stages, the interviews, the curated perfection. But what mattered most were these invisible threads, the ones that pulled them toward each other when everything else tried to pull them apart. Back in the studio a few days later, they recorded vocals side by side again. This time, the song was one they'd written together, a stripped-down ballad that felt more like a conversation than a performance. The lyrics weren't metaphorical or abstract. They were raw. "I didn't know how to reach you when you were right next to me. But I stayed anyway. I stayed even when you didn't see me." Jungkook's voice broke slightly on the second take, not from fatigue, but because the words hit too close. Jimin didn't say anything. He simply walked into the booth, stood behind Jungkook and rested his hand on the younger man's shoulder, steadying him. They recorded it together after that. No harmonies, just two voices carrying the same weight. The final version left the producers silent. No one dared to speak after the playback. And when the last note faded, Jungkook turned to Jimin in the dim light of the booth, emotion flickering behind his eyes. "That's the most honest thing I've ever sung," he whispered. Jimin didn't blink. "That's the most honest thing I've ever felt." The release of the track was subtle. No teaser campaigns, no flashy trailers, just a quiet drop with a handwritten message posted to their joint account. For the moments you thought no one saw you. Fans didn't just stream the song, they lived inside it. The response wasn't explosive, it was intimate. DMs flooded with stories of heartbreak, of reconciliation, of people choosing each other after long silences. Jungkook and Jimin read them late at night, phones in hand, curled up under the same blanket on a quiet Tuesday. They didn't speak as they read, but every few minutes one of them would glance over, as if silently saying, "We did this. Not just for us, but for them too." One evening, as the wind picked up outside their shared apartment in Seoul, Jimin stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the trees sway. Jungkook came up behind him, wrapping his arms gently around his waist. "You ever think about how close we came to losing this?" he asked, his voice soft against Jimin's neck. Jimin leaned back into him, "All the time. And now?" "I think we were meant to fall apart," Jimin said, "just so we could learn how to hold each other better." Jungkook kissed the side of his neck. "I don't want to waste another second not saying what I mean." Jimin turned slowly in his arms, "Then say it." Jungkook searched his face, the familiar curves of his lips, the way his eyes always softened when he was vulnerable. And then he said it, not like a confession, not like a secret, but like a truth that had waited years to be spoken aloud. "I love you." Jimin didn't hesitate. "I love you too." And there it was, not a grand declaration, not a media moment, just the quiet truth that had always lived between them, finally given voice. They stood in that embrace long after the words had been said, letting the wind sing for them, letting the silence hold them steady. In the months that followed, they never made a formal announcement. They didn't need to. The fans already knew. The way they moved on stage, the way their eyes searched for each other during interviews, the small, beautiful ways they took care of each other, those were the only confirmations anyone needed. And sometimes, The most powerful stories aren't told through headlines. They're written in the spaces between verses, in the long silences that end in forgiveness, in the glances that say, "We made it back." And they had. Not as they were, but as who they'd become together.